My name is Marilyn. I'm 58 years old, 33 years of marriage to Tom, and I still remember the first time I saw him. He was everything I wasn't: outgoing, confident, charming. Back then, his presence was a magnetic force, drawing people to him, and I was content to be by his side, supporting him in every way. I didn't need to be the star of the show. I was fine being in the wings. At least, that's what I told myself. I spent my days keeping our home running smoothly, raising our three children, and caring for his elderly mother when she fell ill. It was my job, as I saw it, to make sure everything was perfect for him. His success was mine, too, wasn't it? His achievements reflected well on our family, and that was enough for me. But over the years, the little things started to change. I began to wonder, does he really see me? Or am I just a backdrop to his success? He was always so busy, so focused on the next big deal, the next meeting, the next trip. He'd come home late, tired, and in need of rest, and I would make sure everything at home was taken care of. I never asked for much. He didn't have time for that. It was only in the quiet moments, when I was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes or folding laundry, that I started to feel a growing emptiness. I had done everything for him. I had sacrificed my own ambitions, my own desires, to support his. I had built a life around him and our family, but somewhere along the way, I lost myself in the process. One evening, I was sorting through some old papers in the attic when I came across an old photograph. It was of us, taken on our honeymoon. Tom was smiling, looking as handsome as ever, his arm around me, his eyes full of love. I looked at the picture, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Who was that young woman, smiling so brightly in his arms? She looked so happy, so full of hope. That woman was still in me, somewhere, but I realized as I stared at the photo that Tom had long since forgotten her. He hadn't asked me what I wanted in years. He didn't even know my favorite color anymore. I had always prided myself on being self-sufficient, on not needing attention or recognition. But deep down, I began to feel invisible. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was just a fixture in his life, a part of the background, an accessory to his world. He didn't see me anymore, not really. It wasn't that I didn't love him. I did, in a way that was almost suffocating, a love that had grown out of the years we'd spent together. But I began to wonder, had I lost myself in this marriage? Was I still the woman I had once been, or had I become a shadow of that person, living only for him and our children? And then there was the matter of the children. Our three kids had grown into adults, each of them building their own lives, their own careers, their own families. They were busy. They didn't need me as much anymore. They had their own lives to lead, and I was left behind in the quiet corners of our large home, trying to hold it all together. I never expected to be the center of attention, but I had hoped that after all these years, Tom would at least see me, acknowledge me. But that didn't happen. One evening, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine, I overheard Tom on the phone. His voice was low, hushed, almost nervous. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of conversation I was used to hearing from him. He was always so confident, so in control, but there was something in his voice that night, something I couldn't quite place. I dismissed it at the time. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just stressed about work. After all, he was always under pressure. But later, when I went into his study to retrieve a document, I saw something on his desk, a receipt for an expensive necklace with a name I didn't recognize. I stood there, staring at the receipt, my mind racing. The necklace wasn't for me. It was for someone else who mattered enough to get a gift like that. It was as if the world around me suddenly slowed, and in that moment, I saw something that had been there all along, but that I had been too afraid to face. Tom had moved on, and I was just a ghost in his life. The pain wasn't sharp, but deep. It settled into my chest, heavy and suffocating. I didn't say anything. I didn't scream, didn't confront him. I just slipped the receipt back where it was, walked out of the room, and went on with my day. But inside, I felt a quiet resolve start to take shape. The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't let this go. I wasn't going to be the woman who silently watched as everything I had built crumbled around me. I wasn't going to let him forget me. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it. A few years passed since that moment in the study. Time has a way of either softening the sharp edges of pain or carving new ones. For me, it did both. On the surface, nothing had changed. Tom was still the same charming, successful man, the one everyone admired. He continued to host lavish dinners and attend endless meetings. People sought his advice, and he gave it generously, as if he had all the answers. But as time went on, I noticed subtle shifts in his behavior. At first, they were small things. He started coming home later and later, sometimes not returning until the early hours of the morning. When he did, he'd be distant, distracted. I'd ask how his day went, and he'd brush me off with a vague response. Busy, too much going on. I wasn't stupid. I knew there were business trips that kept him away for days at a time. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, this was his world. His work was demanding. I was used to it. But then I began to notice something else, something that gnawed at me. He started to change. It wasn't just the long hours or the sudden business trips. It was his attitude toward me. He wasn't angry or distant in the way he'd been before. He was just absent. He'd sit at the dinner table, but his eyes were elsewhere, as if he wasn't really there. He'd nod when I spoke, but his mind was always a million miles away. It was during one of these nights that I overheard a conversation in the hallway. I had come out to get a glass of water when I heard his voice, muffled through the door of his study. No, I don't think I can make it this weekend. Marilyn would be upset if I left again, he said, his tone flat. I paused, listening more intently. My heart skipped a beat. But the voice on the other end was a woman's. What about next weekend? It's important. A pause. I couldn't hear his response clearly, but the next words came through loud and clear. All right, I'll figure something out. I stood frozen, feeling the chill of realization settle deep into my bones. This wasn't just about business anymore. The subtle hints had become something more concrete. I wasn't just the wife who waited at home. I was becoming the woman he was trying to hide. I wasn't even sure if I was still his wife. I had become a footnote in his busy life. Later that night, I found something else. A ticket stub. A receipt from a restaurant. Not just any restaurant. This one was known for its exclusivity, its romance, its lavish settings. And it wasn't just the cost that caught my eye. It was the name on the receipt. Lisa. I stared at the receipt for what felt like hours. My mind raced. My heart felt like it was being torn in two. The name on the receipt wasn't unfamiliar, but it wasn't mine. The realization was slow, painful, and inescapable. He was having an affair. I didn't say a word to him that night. I could have. I should have. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the years of silence I'd endured. Perhaps it was the fear of what would come after. Or maybe, just maybe, I had already decided what I would do next. The days passed, and the cracks in our marriage grew wider. The house felt emptier with each passing day. I watched him, always in motion, always consumed with something, but never with me. It was as if I had become invisible. The children noticed it too. Mom, don't take it personally, our youngest, Emily, said one evening. She was 25 now and had already settled into her own life. Dad's just been under a lot of stress lately. You know how he gets. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the truth was there, staring me in the face. He had been living a lie, and I had been too blind, too devoted to see it. And so I did what I should have done years ago. I began preparing. It wasn't a decision I made overnight. I didn't wake up one morning and think, today, I'm going to destroy my marriage. No, this was a slow burn. It started with small things, gathering documents, getting copies of everything. He thought I was too naive, too caught up in my role as his dutiful wife to notice anything. He thought I didn't have the capacity to understand the intricacies of his business, that I couldn't even be bothered to read the mail. He was wrong. I went to a lawyer, a woman named Margaret, who had seen it all. She was sharp, pragmatic, and she didn't ask questions. I explained the situation, about Tom, about the affair, about the years I had spent in his shadow. She didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. She didn't offer sympathy or pity. What she gave me was a plan. We would divide everything. I was entitled to half of everything he had built, half of the business, and half of the life he had created. But it wasn't just the money. I wanted something more, a sense of justice, a way to make him see what he had done to me, to us. Over the next few months, I watched him carefully, documenting every move, every slip up. He thought I was still the same woman I had been all those years ago, docile, silent, and willing to forgive. He couldn't have been more wrong. He was too wrapped up in his own world to notice the quiet preparation that was happening behind the scenes. I wasn't just preparing for the end of our marriage. I was preparing for the moment when I would finally make him pay. The days that followed felt like a blur. I was living two lives. One as the dutiful wife who continued to care for the house, prepare meals, and act as though nothing had changed, and the other as a woman who had made up her mind to take control of her future. I never confronted Tom. He didn't need to know what was happening behind the scenes. I kept my emotions to myself, tucked away like a hidden treasure. But I couldn't shake the thought that he would soon realize that he wasn't the only one with a plan. It wasn't easy. At first, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The hours I had once spent taking care of the family now became hours spent in front of my laptop, gathering information. I learned more about Tom's business than I ever thought possible. I read through contracts, financial reports, and shareholder agreements. I scrolled through emails that weren't meant for my eyes. I found discrepancies, too, a few mistakes that seemed a bit too convenient. I made copies of everything because, in the end, I knew that everything would come down to documentation. Margaret, my lawyer, was a constant presence. We met at her office a few times, but more often, I found myself communicating with her through emails and encrypted messages. She had access to some of the most sensitive information I needed. She was brilliant, a quiet force of nature, and she never let anything slip. I remember one conversation clearly, a few months after I'd started my quiet campaign. "Marilyn," she said one day, her voice calm but firm, "you have to be patient. We're not just going after a divorce settlement here. We're going after everything. But this has to be clean. No mistakes, no emotions, just the facts." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I fully understood. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she was right. Emotions were my enemy now. Anger would only cloud my judgment. If I wanted to make sure Tom paid for everything, I had to think like him, ruthlessly, methodically. As I continued my research, I realized something that made my heart skip a beat. Tom had been hiding assets. Of course, I should have expected that. He had always been the man who calculated every move, and I was starting to see how deep his deception ran. There were shell companies, properties that weren't listed under his name, and accounts that he had neglected to tell me about. One evening, I stayed up late to go over his most recent tax filings. The numbers didn't add up. There were payments to a company in Luxembourg, another in the Cayman Islands, and a few offshore accounts I couldn't trace. The more I looked, the more I found. It was as though Tom thought I would never be able to find it all. But I was methodical. I kept track of every lead, every paper trail. There was no way he was going to get away with this. I also started paying closer attention to his behavior at home. There were days when he seemed like the man I married, the one who could still make me laugh, the one who would hold my hand as we watched the evening news together. But those moments were fleeting. They never lasted long enough for me to believe that anything had really changed. One night, just before Christmas, Tom came into the living room with his usual cheerful demeanor, a glass of wine in his hand. The children and grandchildren had already gathered around the Christmas tree, laughing, exchanging stories. He joined them, acting like the picture-perfect father and grandfather. But I noticed something about his smile. There was a hint of guilt behind it. I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that I saw through his mask. Instead, I sat back in my chair, watching, calculating. He walked past me and kissed me on the cheek. "Merry Christmas, Marilyn," he said, as though everything was normal. But his eyes didn't meet mine, and his voice lacked warmth. "Merry Christmas, Tom," I replied, my voice steady, emotionless. It felt like a formality, a transaction. That was the night I made the decision. I had everything I needed. The evidence was irrefutable, and the process was set in motion. I had already seen the cracks in his facade, and now I was about to make him face the truth. The house was full of noise on Christmas Eve. The scent of roasted turkey and freshly baked pies filled the air, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls. Our 3 grown children and their families had gathered at our home for the holiday, as they always did. It was the one time of year when we were all supposed to come together, to forget the distance that had grown between us, to pretend that everything was still as it had been. I watched from the corner of the room, where I had quietly settled into a chair near the fireplace. Tom, the center of attention as always, beamed at everyone, telling jokes and making everyone laugh with his usual charm. It was as though he was still the man he had once been, the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But I knew the truth now. This man was a stranger to me, a man who had deceived me, a man who had betrayed not just our marriage, but the life we had built together. I observed him, noting the way he touched his daughter's shoulder, or how he leaned in a little too closely to his youngest son-in-law as they whispered together. He acted the part of the loving father and husband so effortlessly, it almost seemed like he believed it himself. I wanted to laugh, I wanted to scream, but I stayed still, calm, collected. "Marilyn, would you help me with the drinks?" Tom's voice pulled me from my thoughts. He smiled at me, but there was something cold in his eyes. The mask was slipping, and I knew it. He was pretending, just like I had been for so long. I nodded and followed him into the kitchen. He opened the fridge, pulling out a bottle of champagne, and began pouring it into glasses with an exaggerated flourish. "We'll drink to the family," he said, his voice cheerful. "The kids, the grandkids, you've done such a wonderful job raising them, Marilyn." His words felt like a compliment, but the way he said it, almost as if he were ticking off a box, told me everything I needed to know. I smiled tightly. "Thank you, Tom." There was a pause, and I could feel the tension building. Then, with a slight chuckle, he added, "You've been so good to me all these years. I'm grateful, really." His eyes flickered down to the counter, avoiding mine. He was already looking for an escape. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was it, the moment when everything would change. We returned to the living room, where the children were gathered around the tree. They were exchanging gifts, their faces lit with excitement as they tore open wrapping paper. Tom took his place beside them, settling into the armchair with a contented sigh. He looked like he was the king of the world. And then I saw it. He reached under the tree and pulled out a small box wrapped in shiny paper. The others were already opening gifts, their voices filled with excitement and gratitude. But when Tom handed the gift to our youngest daughter, it was as if the room suddenly quieted. The smile on her face was wide, but there was something different about it, something that made me uneasy. I had been watching for this moment all day, the moment when Tom would give a gift to everyone except me. He was good at this, good at pretending to be the perfect husband and father, good at pretending he cared. But I had seen the truth behind the act. I knew what would happen. He would give gifts to everyone but me. It wasn't even about the presents themselves. It was about the way he always managed to make me feel invisible, forgotten. Sure enough, as the children opened their gifts, there was no gift for me, not even a card. Tom leaned back in his chair, a smug expression on his face, as he watched everyone's reactions. His demeanor was casual, almost as if he didn't care. He didn't even look at me as he handed out gifts. He smiled at our son-in-law, cracked a joke with one of the grandkids, and went on as though everything was fine. I wasn't surprised. After all, why would he remember me when he had so many other things, so many other people to think about? But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. Not anymore. I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting too long. All eyes turned toward me as I approached the tree. Tom, I said, my voice calm but sharp, there's one last gift. A silence fell over the room, and everyone stared at me, confused. Tom's smile faltered. Marilyn, you don't need anything, he said, his voice casual, almost dismissive. He waved a hand as though to brush it off, but I wasn't about to let him make this about me being difficult. I didn't flinch. I looked at the family, at the children and grandchildren who still had no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. I reached down and picked up the small box I had carefully placed under the tree earlier that afternoon. It wasn't wrapped in shiny paper or decorated with ribbons. No, it was simple, plain even. But inside was something that would change everything. I held it up in front of the family. Let's open this one together, I said, my voice steady, filled with purpose. Tom's face turned white. He stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing. What is this, Marilyn? His voice dropped, and I could hear the edge of panic in it. Open it and see, I replied, my lips curving into a thin smile. The box was passed around, and one by one everyone opened it. Inside were 3 documents, neatly folded. I could see the realization slowly dawning on their faces as they read each one. The first was a notice of division of property, the legal language clear and unambiguous. The second was a report on Tom's infidelity, photos included, and the names of the women he'd been involved with over the past several years. The last was a letter from my lawyer, along with her contact details and the address where all future correspondence should be sent. There was a moment of silence. I could see Tom's face go from confusion to disbelief to outright anger. He looked at me, his lips trembling as though he were about to shout. But he didn't. Instead, he laughed, nervously at first, then more convincingly. Is this some sort of joke, Marilyn? He said, trying to hold his composure. You can't be serious. But I had already seen enough. The filing date on the documents was 3 months ago. I had been planning this for far longer than he knew. I wasn't asking for anything anymore. I had made my choice. And as I looked around at the stunned faces of our children and grandchildren, I knew it was over. Tom's laughter died in the air like a popped balloon. leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, I thought he might actually break down. But no, Tom had always been good at pretending. His eyes flickered from one family member to the next, but no one spoke. It wasn't the reaction he had been expecting. They were all too stunned to speak, too shocked to even breathe. I watched him, knowing that this was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment where the curtain would fall and reveal everything. Tom's mouth twisted into a grimace. He was trying to salvage the situation, trying to convince everyone it was some cruel joke. Marilyn, this isn't funny. Why are you doing this? His voice cracked slightly, a telltale sign of his growing anxiety. I shook my head slowly, not allowing myself to feel sorry for him. I'm not doing this to be funny, Tom. You've spent years laughing at my expense. Today, I'm the one doing the talking. He took a step toward me, his hand raised as if he were about to strike me, but I didn't flinch. I had seen all his tricks before. His anger was nothing but a mask. It always had been. You think this is the end? He sneered. You think I'll just stand here while you tear everything down? You're out of your mind. But I wasn't tearing anything down. I was building something new, something he could never take away from me. I'm not tearing anything down, Tom, I replied quietly. I'm simply taking what's mine. The rest of the family remained silent, their eyes flicking between Tom and me. My children stood frozen, unsure of what to say, their faces unreadable. It was clear that they were just as stunned by this revelation as their father was. They had always believed the version of our life that Tom had fed them, perfect, unshakable, and untouchable. But now that illusion was gone, and I wasn't about to let it linger any longer. I took a deep breath and looked at Tom again. These papers, they're just the beginning. I don't want your money, Tom. I don't want your power, your prestige, or your business. What I want is my life back. And if that means watching you squirm, then so be it. Tom stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight with fury. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. Instead, he just stood there, struggling to make sense of it all. I saw the doubt creeping in. He knew I was serious now. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. I had carefully planned every detail. Marilyn, he began again, his voice shaking now. You don't have to do this. We can work this out. I'll fix everything. I swear I'll fix it. Fix it? I repeated, my voice rising slightly. You've been fixing things for years, Tom. Fixing them for your benefit, for your ego. Well, now I'm fixing things for me. I watched him stumble back into the armchair, collapsing into it like a man who had just realized he was no longer in control. The children were still staring at the papers, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. The grandkids, thankfully, hadn't fully grasped what was going on, but they could sense the tension in the air. It wasn't Christmas anymore. It was a battlefield. I don't need anything from you anymore, I said softly. I'll take my share and walk away. No questions asked. Tom didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at the papers again, his face drained of color. He picked up the first one, the division of property document, and read it again, his eyes skimming over the words, but not truly absorbing them. For a moment, I wondered if he might still try to manipulate me, try to convince me that this was all a misunderstanding. But I knew better. It was too late for that. I had already made my decision. Tom stood up abruptly, knocking over a glass of champagne in his haste. You think you've won? He spat, his voice low and dangerous. You think this will destroy me? You think I'm scared of losing everything? You should be, I said calmly, stepping closer to him. Because, Tom, I've spent too many years standing in your shadow, waiting for you to see me. But now I'm not waiting anymore. I turned away from him, my heart pounding, but I refused to show it. This was the final moment. No turning back. The rest of the evening passed in a haze, with Tom's attempts to salvage his image falling flat. The family had retreated into awkward conversations, pretending to ignore the elephant in the room. But I knew what had happened. The truth had been exposed, and no amount of charm or manipulation would ever hide it again. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings with my lawyer, and a quiet house that once felt full of life. Tom didn't speak to me directly again. He tried, of course, sending messages through the kids, asking me to reconsider, to take back the papers. But I knew there was nothing to reconsider. There was no going back. On Christmas morning, Tom left the house early, muttering something about a business trip. I didn't bother to ask where he was going. It didn't matter anymore. That evening, as I sat alone in the house, the emptiness pressing in on me, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a long, hard look at my reflection in the hallway mirror. For the first time in a long time, I saw myself clearly, not as the wife of Tom, the woman behind the scenes, but as Marilyn, the woman I had lost somewhere along the way, but had finally found again. I knew what I had to do. The next Christmas, I would no longer be sitting by the tree, watching everyone else open gifts. I would be celebrating my own victory, my own life, and this time I wouldn't be forgotten. As the year passed, I sold the house, everything I could. Tom stayed in the house, but the life we had built together was slipping through his fingers. The business, once thriving, began to show signs of wear. Without me behind the scenes, everything was crumbling, and he didn't know how to fix it. I didn't care. I was free. And as Christmas neared once again, I made a decision. I would buy myself a gift this year, a symbol of my new beginning. I found a small bronze sculpture of a woman holding a scale, a perfect representation of the balance I had regained in my life. I smiled as I placed it under my little Christmas tree in my new apartment. The next morning, as I opened the gift I had given myself, I realized something. This year, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. The first few weeks after the Christmas revelation were a strange mixture of chaos and clarity. For Tom, the business world he had so carefully constructed began to fall apart piece by piece. The board meetings were tense, his temper more volatile, and his decisions more erratic. Without me handling the finances, the logistics, and the behind-the-scenes negotiations, he had nothing but a pile of paperwork and dwindling connections. At first, I felt a small sense of satisfaction watching him stumble. He was the one who had left me in the dark for all those years, the one who had walked through life acting as though I were nothing more than a piece of furniture, a silent fixture in the background. Now I was the one in control, and he was the one fumbling, trying desperately to hold on to everything that was slipping through his fingers. But that satisfaction, as sweet as it was, didn't last long. It became clear to me that I was no longer a part of the world I had once known. I had lived in the shadow of his success for over 3 decades, always playing the role of the supportive wife, the silent partner. Now, it was as though I were a ghost in the life I had once built. And while I wasn't sorry for my decisions, there were moments when the silence of my new life felt deafening. I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was mine. The walls were white and bare, except for a few pieces of art I had carefully chosen. Large windows overlooked a quiet street, and the low hum of the city outside was strangely comforting. It wasn't the life I had expected, but it was mine now, and that was enough. The first few days were the hardest. I spent hours sorting through the boxes of things I had brought with me: old clothes, books, trinkets from a life I no longer recognized. I could have thrown it all away, But there was something comforting in holding on to the past, even if it no longer served me. But as the days passed, I began to embrace the silence. I spent more time reflecting, more time with myself. I read books I had never had time for, started hobbies I had once dreamed of, but never had the courage to pursue. I found joy in small things, the way the sunlight danced on the floor in the morning, the smell of coffee brewing, the sound of birds singing outside my window. These were the things I had missed, buried under the weight of a life I had lived for someone else. And then there was the business that Tom had once ruled with an iron fist. Now it was mine. I had always known that Tom had tried to hide things from me. The receipts for gifts I didn't receive, the trips he took that I never knew about, the long hours spent at work when he was too busy to come home. But I had never truly understood the depths of his deception until I started looking through the documents I had taken from the house. The company wasn't just a business, it was a network, a web of assets, properties, and offshore accounts that Tom had carefully hidden from me, from the world. As I reviewed the papers, I realized something. The company, the wealth, the power, it was never really his. It had always been ours, but he had treated it like his personal kingdom. Now I was going to take what was mine. I had learned a lot over the years, quietly observing his every move, memorizing the details of his empire, the balance sheets, the investments, the contacts. Everything was right there in front of me. Tom had always underestimated me, thinking I was nothing more than a housewife, a mother, a shadow. But I had been paying attention all along. In the months that followed, I began making my own moves. I hired a financial advisor, a lawyer, and an accountant, people I could trust, people who could help me navigate the complexities of Tom's empire. I was careful, methodical, and patient. I didn't need to rush. After all, I had waited 33 years for this moment. Meanwhile, Tom was scrambling. His business was crumbling under the weight of my actions. He was losing contracts, his partners were pulling away, and the once glamorous events he attended were now nothing more than empty social gatherings. It didn't take long before he started reaching out to me again. Through the children, through his lawyer, through mutual friends. He begged me to reconsider, to work things out. But I was done. I had learned to recognize the games he played, the manipulation, the empty promises. He thought that by offering me money or property, he could buy me back. But he didn't understand. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his life. I wanted my own. One afternoon, just a few weeks before Christmas, Tom's lawyer called mine. The conversation was brief but telling. She wants only one thing, my lawyer had said: silence. And that's what I got. Tom tried to stop the process. He tried to convince me to back out, to give him a chance to fix things. But the deadlines had passed, the agreements were in place, and it was too late. Tom was still living in the house we had shared for years, but it no longer felt like a home. The house had become a symbol of everything that had been wrong with our life. It was a shell, empty and cold, filled with memories I no longer wanted. Meanwhile, my lawyer and I made sure everything was in order. I didn't want to deal with the fallout from Tom's collapse. All I needed was the peace of knowing that I had taken control of my life, that I had done what was necessary to rebuild. As the months passed, I learned to adjust to my new life. The loneliness was still there, but it wasn't as overwhelming as I thought it would be. I spent more time with friends, even though they were few. I focused on my own growth, my own happiness. The world was open to me in a way it never had been before, but nothing felt more satisfying than the next Christmas. The year had passed, and I had rebuilt. The house I had once called home was now in someone else's hands, and I was free. The Christmas tree in my apartment was small, but it was mine. The bronze sculpture of a woman holding a scale sat proudly beneath it. It was the only gift I had given myself, but it was the most meaningful one. And as I sat there, watching the lights on the tree twinkle softly, I realized something. I was no longer a shadow. I was no longer defined by him or anyone else. I had reclaimed myself, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The silence of my new life was deafening at first, but as the days wore on, it became more like a friend, a companion I had long been denied. The world I had known with Tom, his empire, his friends, his status, had faded into the background. I no longer cared about the parties, the business dinners, or the endless charades of success. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely. The weight that had been crushing me for so long was gone. I spent my days adjusting to the rhythms of this new existence. My mornings were simple. I woke up early, made myself a cup of coffee, and spent time by the window, watching the world wake up. The apartment was small, but it was bright. The sunlight filtered in through the large windows, casting a warm glow across the room. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. The first few months were filled with small victories. I learned how to manage my finances on my own, how to make the most of what I had. The savings I had taken from the house, the shares in the company, everything was carefully invested, slowly growing into something more substantial. I wasn't interested in becoming a millionaire overnight. I just wanted the security of knowing that I could stand on my own without relying on anyone else. One of the first things I did was take a trip. I had always dreamed of seeing the world, but it had never been possible. Tom had always been too busy, too involved in his work. But now I could go wherever I wanted. I spent a week in Paris, wandering the streets, visiting museums, and enjoying the freedom that came with being truly alone. The trip was everything I had imagined: quiet, peaceful, and liberating. I returned home with a sense of calm, the world feeling much smaller, but in the best possible way. And then the holidays came again. Christmas, a time of family, of tradition, of celebration. But for me, this Christmas was different. I was different. I didn't expect gifts. I didn't need them. For years, I had received presents from Tom: expensive jewelry, clothes, the latest gadgets, but they had always felt empty, like hollow gestures meant to fill a void. This year, I had nothing to prove. The gift I had given myself, the sculpture, was all I needed. But there was something else, something that had been quietly gnawing at me since the moment I left the house. The children, our children. They had been so wrapped up in Tom's world, so absorbed in their own lives, that they hadn't really noticed when I disappeared. They had all but abandoned me in the years leading up to my leaving. Of course, they had their own families, their own problems, but I had always been there for them, silent, supportive, uncomplaining. And now, it felt as though I didn't even exist to them. At first, I didn't care. I told myself that I was better off without them. But as Christmas approached, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. There were no calls, no visits, no "Merry Christmas, Mom," like there used to be. It was as though I had been erased from their lives, a forgotten figure in the background of their success. I didn't reach out to them. I wasn't going to be the one to chase after them. But I knew that if they wanted to see me, if they wanted to make an effort, they would come. I wasn't going to beg for their attention, not anymore. Christmas Eve came, and I spent it alone. The tree in my apartment was lit, the lights twinkling softly in the darkness. I had made myself a simple dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a glass of wine. It was quiet, peaceful, and yet there was a part of me that missed the chaos of the old family gatherings. I thought back to the Christmases of the past, when the house had been filled with laughter, with children running around, with Tom at the center, the undisputed king of our family. I remembered the years when I had been content to watch from the sidelines, to play my part, to make everything perfect for everyone else. But those days were gone now, and I didn't miss them as much as I thought I would. As I sat there, alone at the table, I felt a sense of gratitude for what I had gained, my freedom, my peace, my independence, and yet I couldn't ignore the part of me that still wished things had been different, that still longed for the connection with my children, with my family. The next morning, Christmas Day, was more of the same. The world outside my window was blanketed in snow, soft and still. I had no expectations, no plans. I sat on the couch, sipping my coffee, watching the snow fall, and then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up slowly, my heart beating a little faster. Who could it be? When I opened the door, I was surprised to see my daughter, Amanda, standing there. She looked different, older, more serious, but her eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time: regret. "Merry Christmas, Mom," she said quietly, her voice uncertain. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't seen her in months, not since the last time she came over to visit Tom, to check on things. She had barely acknowledged me then, too absorbed in her own life. Now here she was, standing on my doorstep, looking as though she had something to say. "I know I haven't been the best daughter," she continued, "and I'm sorry. We've all been caught up in our own lives, and I didn't realize how much I hurt you. I should have been there. I should have known, but I didn't." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I hadn't expected an apology, not from her, not from any of them. But here it was, raw and honest. She stepped forward, holding out a small box wrapped in gold paper. "I know it's not much," she said, "but I wanted you to have something. A real gift for the first time in years." I took the box from her, carefully unwrapping it. Inside was a necklace, simple but elegant. It wasn't expensive, but it didn't matter. It was the first real gift I had received in years, and in that moment I realized something. It wasn't about the gift itself. It was about the gesture, the acknowledgement. And as I looked up at Amanda, standing there with tears in her eyes, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a new chapter, not just for me, but for all of us. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope.